despite the great weather, or maybe because of the great weather. So in the past few years, it seems like a whole new lexicon has entered the world of media. You hear a lot about echo chambers or fake news or misinformation or filter bubbles. And it seems like, you know, these are the most important or the most pressing topics in discussing relationships between citizens, democracy, and media. This research project of, and I hope that I pronounced it rightly, Magdalena Wojcieszak has revealed there might be a more pressing issue when we discuss these issues, namely the news diet of citizens or the lack of such a thing. Because if we are what we eat, we are also what we read. And it seems that, but I'm not going to tell too much about what you've discovered, it's also very important what we don't read. Citizens who are less informed, of course, are also more susceptible to manipulative messages. And why this matters and also what we can do about this will be discussed later in the platform. But first of all, I'd like to welcome Magdalena and good luck.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh. Well, thank you all for coming here. Again, despite the good weather and despite the strike of the trains in Amsterdam, I really appreciate you being here. And of course, I greatly appreciate the organizers and Fatima and Karen, who helped incredibly much with the organization of the event. And of course, our fantastic panelists, who you will hear from later. And of course, the project would not be possible at all without my wonderful collaborators and postdocs and students who are listed here in alphabetical order. So I will try to keep my presentation short. It's, of course, challenging given that I'm presenting 5 years of research. But I will focus only on a few studies, and then, of course, I can share some other work with you later. So let's dive in. Exactly as was introduced at the beginning, many people fear that unprecedented choice in the current media environment leads people to select hyper-partisan news sources, inhabit echo chambers, be put in rabbit holes of radicalization on social media, encounter misinformation. And the fear is that these kinds of behaviors online lead to polarization, misinformation, declining support for democratic norms, and many other problems that many societies are facing. So, many scholars examine partisan news, echo chambers, misinformation, and algorithmic filter bubbles. And foundations fuel millions to support research on these topics. So, in fact, over 6 years ago, I received 1.5 million euros to study precisely exposure to congenial partisan news and to dissimilar news and their effects on polarization, intergroup tolerance, misinformation, and other attitudes. So just very briefly, with my wonderful team, we fielded a very challenging study. Here is a graph of the study in the US, the Netherlands, and Poland, where I'm originally from, hence my unpronounceable last name. And we combine over time survey self-reports with online behavioral data from the same participants. So essentially very large samples of individuals in those 3 countries took surveys 3 months apart and submitted or shared with us their online browsing history. So to get what people did online, we used Web Historian, which is an open source tool developed by my friend and collaborator. And the tool accesses people's browsing history stored on their computers, displays it to them using different visualizations, and allows them to submit their data to researchers. So I'm happy to talk about it later. It's not that essential. The most important point is that this tool allowed us to get information on everything that people did online during 9 months. So that's the point. And people are willing to share that information with researchers for not that much money. So that's also interesting. So we had about 120 million visits in general. Again, very briefly, we categorized the visits as being to news domains. We developed very extensive lists per each country. We categorized the visits as being to left-leaning news, right-leaning news websites, or centrist news. And we also classified, using kind of at-scale methodologies, whether people visited political content or news about politics in their online visits. So, in the couple of studies I will mention, we use subsets of those data, so not every study uses all this. But first, we wanted to check this pressing problem. Does exposure to hyper-partisan media polarize individual attitudes and makes people more hostile toward the other political side? So, for example, a left-leaning person who consumes left-leaning news can develop stronger attitudes on a variety of political topics, immigration, climate change, and so forth. And a person who is left-leaning but consumes right-leaning news can actually become a little bit more moderate, perhaps. That's what we wanted to test. So the title gives away our findings already. Just super briefly, because again, I want to keep this short, we found absolutely no overtime effects of actual exposure to partisan news on attitude polarization and so-called affective polarization, so people's hostility toward the other political side. Again, this, I will just skim through that. And in another study, I mentioned here because Karen tweeted about it, so she kind of made me feel that I need to include it. We actually tested whether exposure to hyper-partisan news from the other political side can generate polarization, the so-called backfire effect, or can actually attenuate polarization. So, also, very briefly, the graph shows the design of the study. The major, most important thing is that we paid American partisans to visit hyper-partisan news on the other side of the political spectrum for 12 consecutive days. We checked people. So, for example, a Democratic participant was paid to look at far-right news sources such as Breitbart or The Blaze, and Democratic participants were paid to look at, and Republican participants were paid to look at, for example, The Nation and other very left-leaning sources. We had extensive checks to make sure that people, in fact, did what we told them to do. And again, we found that these exposures had almost no effects on people's attitudes. So people were, again, seeing every day information from hyper-partisan news, and that didn't change their attitudes at all. So, just in brief, we found no polarization from hyper-partisan news, and again, we tracked actual exposure to those websites of individuals. And in another study, we found no effects on misinformation endorsement. We found incredibly limited exposure to untrustworthy websites among our sample. So kind of all the issues that many people worry about were a very small fraction of citizens' online diets and didn't have any effects. And in fact, recent research also finds that most people don't inhabit so-called online echo chambers. Most people do not encounter misinformation online. Most people do not aren't put in the so-called rabbit holes of radicalization on social media and so forth. So there must be other explanations for the different democratic challenges that many countries face. And of course, I don't argue that the media are the only explanation. There are many sociocultural, global factors that contribute to that. But my suspicion or argument is that the drastically overlooked problem is the very low consumption of the good democratic broccoli, which is quality news among the population. So, in fact, this is what emerged as a kind of key explanation for our null results in the studies. So we know that news is not as appealing as other categories of programming. We all have Netflix. We all have, or some of us have Netflix or other online entertainment platforms. And many people see news as very complex, or very boring, or both. Many people are actually averse to partisan politics. They are just done. I don't want to hear about it anymore. And there is research that shows that many people actively avoid news. So accordingly, across mobile and desktop, and these percentages are from, the first percentages from the United States, news accounts only for 4% of total online consumption. And Facebook estimates that news constitutes only 1.8% of what circulates on the platform. That's not that much. And of course, and I had this conversation before the panel, that yes, more people consume news on television than online, but still, other categories of content vastly outnumber news exposure. And there is also some research to back this up. And in our data, and here I'm showing data from 3 countries. In 3 countries, across 9 months, news accounted for an average of 3.4% of everything that people did online. And, good for you here, because the news consumption was the highest in the Netherlands, 4%, the lowest, surprise, surprise, in the United States. But still, those percentages were very low. And furthermore, most people do not go to news websites for political information. Actually, the solid majority of news visits in our data were to sports or weather or cooking recipes, so not to hard news. So in short, 96.6% of everything that people do online is not news, and the majority of that is not political news. And such low levels of news consumption are democratically problematic. We know that they may lead to uninformed citizenry, voting that's misaligned with individual or group interest, and also susceptibility to hyper-partisan or populist or misinformative, manipulative rhetoric. And, for instance, we can think of Brexit or the 2016 US election as good examples of low information voters being swayed to action by, emotional stimuli in the political environment. And we also know that news media exposure contribute to well-informed citizens, more stable political attitudes, greater resistance to manipulation, greater ability to recognize what's fact, what's fabrication, and so forth. So essentially, now I argue that incentivizing greater news consumption, so greater consumption of quality news, this is important, I will come back to that, among citizens is very important and very pressing. So I avoid the simplistic assumption that all news, so to speak, are created equal. Right? We wouldn't want to incentivize hyper-partisan news exposure or exposure to very sensationalist tabloids. So we do need to focus on quality and verified news, and I will mention that in a second. I will mention 2 studies just very briefly that aim to do that, aim to encourage citizens to consume more news on social media. And we also account for a kind of algorithmic curation of what people see online per the expertise of one of our panelists. So in the first study, we designed a very large field experiment on Twitter. So again, a platform that's kind of falling apart. When we started developing the study, it was still, good, but there have been many hurdles along the way. So we encourage social media users to follow and consume news using Twitter bots that reply contextually to users' tweets about sports and entertainment and lifestyle topics, and encourage them to follow news accounts and consume news. So here you can see Liz and Jacob, two of our bots, many of whom were banned along the way. And here you see how those bots were responding. So for instance, in the first part of the response, the bots were engaging with what the person posted. And then we had a so-called hard-coded component where we say, by the way, if you want to learn more about sports, consider, and we directed people to a news media organization, consider visiting a sports section of, say, the New York Times, and consider following at the New York Times. So we're still analyzing data. We find some results. And again, the project was a little problematic because somebody took over the platform and disabled many of the functionalities. And in the second study, we promote exposure to quality news on YouTube, which is one of the most popular social media platforms. And we aim here to disentangle two factors that can lead to low news consumption, which is the disinterest of individual citizens or the algorithms. So if low news media consumption is due to the fact that citizens do not see news as relevant to their lives or important, then nudging the users and reminding them that news are important can perhaps encourage people to watch more news. But then if low news consumption is due to algorithmic biases, such that if somebody's interested in sports, they're only recommended sports over and over because that's what they engage in, then nudging the algorithm, so to speak, can potentially increase news exposure because news will be recommended to the user. So in collaboration with a few computer scientists, we developed an extension for YouTube that users installed. And here are some screenshots. Doesn't matter exactly what we did. But I'm happy to talk about it. But we nudged users by creating this really realistic looking banner here that contained several prompts that were piloted before that essentially told people that news exposure can be beneficial to them, but also to society and democracy at large and so forth. And you can see here that the people were, if they clicked here, they were taken to the news part of YouTube. There was also a little nudge in the search box to watch the news. So that's how we nudged the users. And we nudged the algorithm by essentially tricking it that a user is interested in news. So our extension in the background, every 10 minutes, watched news videos from quality news organizations. So essentially, we were adding news to users' browsing history or watch history to trick the algorithm that the user is interested in news. And we selected those news organizations to be credible or kind of high on credibility and also rather centrist. So we used expert metrics to do that. And we are finding some promising results. So the algorithmic nudge indeed increased recommendations to news. And then when more news is easily available to the user online, people were actually watching much more news during the time of our experiment, and it lasted for about 3 weeks. So stay tuned for the results. But I just wanted to mention that that's what we're still doing. But overall, just to finish up, I believe that the problem is less that people consume bad political information. The problem is that most people do not consume any political information. So promoting greater engagement with quality news, online or offline, as we will talk now most likely, can make citizens more resilient to misinformation, to populism, and can also pull the more moderate voices, those citizens who are now completely disengaged, onto the political arena and therefore minimize polarization. So I feel that we need to expand our focus from the very hot and sexy and popular issues of echo chambers, filter bubbles, misinformation, to identify why people do not consume news, how to encourage people to do so, and how, again, we can make citizens a bit more resilient and democracy stronger. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, and I will look forward to the panel now.
Yes, thank you, Magdalena, and congrats on concluding your research project. Next up for the panel, I'd like to invite a few people up on the stage. First of all, Nicholas Diakopoulos, who is an associate professor in communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University in Chicago. Alit Damstra, who is a senior research fellow at the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy, better known as the WRR, where she studies media and democracy in the digitalized age. And finally, Harm Edebodje, investigative reporter at Follow the Money, an investigative journalistic platform, and the co-author of the book My Opinions Are Facts, The Making of Thierry Baudet. And I will join them, and I forgot to say this in the introduction, but my name is Mark-Lies Adriaanse, and I'm a reporter with NRC Handelsblad, Dutch newspaper. Yeah, so Magdalena, one of the things that popped into my mind during your presentation was, have we had the wrong conversation for all these years? Was all the fuss about fake news for nothing?
I don't think so, right? I think it was important because it did direct our attention to some issues that social media and the online environment facilitates. So it's not that they were absent before, just the scale increased. But I do think that somehow we stopped looking at the broader picture, just focusing on these other problems. So I don't think that the conversation was for nothing. It was very useful, I believe. But still, we know also research shows that there is now more discussion of misinformation than actual misinformation. There is more discussion about polarization, so perceived polarization, the perception that the public is polarized, increased at much higher level than actual polarization, right? So we are, in a sense, we scholars and journalists are, in a sense, generating reality that's more gloomy or pessimistic than what I think it actually is. But
now, you've done a lot of research about misinformation or about citizenship, democracy in the Netherlands. How surprised are you with these conclusions? And do you agree with Magdalena that perceived misinformation and perceived polarization is a bigger problem than actual polarization at this moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you first, Magdalena, for this very, very, very interesting presentation. Also very interesting and sometimes surprising results. I'm not sure whether I find this message very optimistic because also the very low quality news consumption should be worrisome, I think, maybe even more than the whole idea of misinformation, echo chambers and filter bubbles. I was wondering, this also really touches upon the literature on news avoidance, because people obviously avoid the news, or at least the quality news. And at some point in your presentation, you said it is intentional. So people, they get tired of the news. It's all maybe too pessimistic or whatever the reason may be. And I was wondering, isn't it also maybe unintentional, and isn't the overload of information, and also for people maybe with preferences for entertainment, are just not very inclined to click on the news that is more informative? So and also in relation to your algorithmic nudging, if people intentionally avoid the news, then that wouldn't be a cure, right? So I would be very interesting. That was what I was really, I found that very intriguing, and would love to hear more about that. Yeah. So is it intentional or not, and what to do about it?
So, yes, so there are absolutely, it's not that all news avoidance is intentional. There are many people who intentionally avoid news, so they're just sick of it. That was especially prevalent during COVID, because news, we know, tends to be very negative, tends to be kind of depressing, so people were just tired. But many people absolutely have, so to speak, unintentional news avoidance. They just may not see news at all in their online ecosystem, for instance. And what you mentioned about the nudges, actually we found, that was a very important analysis. We found that this increasing recommendations to news not only increased exposure to news amongst people, but it didn't decrease overall engagement. So people, it's not that people, oh, okay, I don't want to see news, so let me just not watch YouTube at all, because, you know, those researchers are feeding me news. So yeah, we found it didn't have an adverse effect on people's on-platform engagement. So maybe for some people, just providing quality information in a very easy way, right? So here it is, you know, I'm watching YouTube and it just appears and plays automatically after, you know, my music video or my yoga video or whatever. Maybe that can actually make people a little bit open to this information. And then, so then it's not that they just don't want to see it. Maybe they just don't have the opportunity to see it. But then when it appears, they will engage with it.
Well, that is indeed a more optimistic finding, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're on the more pessimistic side of this argument.
No, well, no, well, I think this is genuinely, this is very interesting, and also this is quite optimistic because it gives us a direction of what to do about it, right? And this is doable. In the end, because I think that's also what is key to this debate, that we find it so difficult what to do about this phenomenon. I do have more questions, but maybe
I'm eager to hear more from you two.
Yeah, sure.
Harm, you've worked at Dutch media for a very long time. You've worked at Vrij Nederland when it was still one of the more influential Dutch weeklies. You then paid with a lot of subscriptions. Then you worked for nu.nl, which is a free digital outlet, one of the biggest Dutch news media. And now you're working for, once again, for a subscription-based platform.
Yeah. Well, some remarks. I just checked that the main news here in the Netherlands, the television news, on Saturday night was watched by 1.5 million viewers, which is more or less average, I guess. That means less than 10% of the Dutch audience watch the news at 8 o'clock. Of course, they have reruns in the night, so it adds a bit more, but still, it's 10%. That's more than your 4 or 5%, but still, it's only 10%. So 90% of the Dutch audience didn't watch that edition of the news. When I worked at nu.nl, which is by far the biggest online news platform in the Netherlands, I always said to my colleagues when I worked there, you can count NRC Handelsblad, Volkskrant, and Trouw and Parool all together, and then you don't even have the audience that nu.nl attracts. I mean, it's really, really big. When I worked there, I wrote stories, and I didn't start at less than 150,000 views. But then, I mean, 150,000 views, that's only 1%. I mean, we have 70 million, but still, I mean, it's like 1%. So a major scoop scored like 1.5 million readers around the viewers at the audience for the news, the 8 o'clock news, which is still only 10%. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, whether it's an online or it's offline or it's television, that the audiences are really small compared to the complete population of a city or a country. About the echo chambers, I went to lots of court cases related to the activism around Corona protests. I mean, we had huge protests. Sometimes they were very violent. People were threatened. People in our ministers, the cabinet people were threatened. So I went to a few of these court cases, and again, what you find here in this meta search of yours I can confirm from sitting in the court that it's only 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 people who are inside this mousetrap and who decide to go on the street with a torch in front of the house of the minister. It's just one guy.
But he's very influential, though.
Exactly. Yeah,
but he's very influential inside the echo chamber.
Absolutely.
And now it's going outside, but still, I mean, if I go to the Leidseplein just last week, to the Russian tank that was parked there, you know, he was there, but nobody recognized him. I just checked some people. Do you know that's the Fakkelman who was in the street with the minister? Nobody knew. Nobody recognized his face. Nobody knew the story, or some knew the story. So still, I mean, his fame isn't that big. But I do understand that our secret services and security agencies are really worried about him, because people like him who are inside these traps can become violent and are a real threat to people's lives.
Absolutely.
So so those are different discussions. There you go.
Nick.
Can I jump in? Sure. So what I like about this conversation and what we've been talking about, and also about your results, is that I think it really gets at this idea of the complex system of news consumption, right? It's about news production and quality information or conspiracy theories, but it's also about news consumption and the demand for that information. And it's also about the algorithms, and can you use algorithms to nudge demand, the matching supply and demand and so on. But I think what it also gets at, and this is kind of where you were going, Harm, is that our conception of why news is important, news consumption is important to democracy, maybe gets a little bit lost in the analysis in terms of, you know, maybe it's not just about that everyone eats their broccoli. It's about the fact that there could be a very small audience that has political implications for the entire society because of some very cloistered consumption of information. And so I don't know what we do about that. You know, is there a way to address that in the complex system? It's not really about the supply of quality information anymore. It's more about the algorithms, the demand for really low quality conspiracy information. And I think addressing that is maybe a little bit different problem to try to deal with.
But there's a big normative assumption underneath this, right? Namely that polarization, but also populism, is in itself a danger to democracy. That polarization should be prevented by news media, by professionals, and that populism in itself is anti-democratical, maybe? It's quite a, this was my main thought when I was seeing the algorithms. You're pushing people towards more centrist political positions. It's quite a big political move to do such a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting point that you're making. And I would say, but I'm not sure what Magdalena says about it, that there's an important difference in that sense between the partisan diversity across the spectrum and the fact that you kind of agree what the facts are, right? So, to put it very simple, partisan polarization in the sense of partisan views, I think it's perfectly fine in a democracy. It's something we should cherish, to be honest. But at the same time, there's this phenomenon of disinformation, and that's in some instances very anti-democratic. And I think that it's perfectly legitimate to want to counter the second instead of the first. So I think that difference is very important to make, right?
Well, of course, there are several things at the same time we're discussing here, I guess. So, I mean, the danger of people who are in these mousetraps, in one way or another. I mean, there were mousetraps in the 70s and in the 80s. I mean, that's something for this.
Also, a lot of people with torches in the Middle Ages, so...
Yeah, no, then you enter the world of police and security services and judges. I mean, that's from old times, I think. The other thing is that it's a relatively small group, so you're right about the echo chambers, and I think it's the whole nudging idea, that's algorithms and that's technology. But also, when I worked at nu.nl, we did another thing, which is on our side, on the journalistic side of the equation, is that we, not me, but my colleagues, they made articles for people who couldn't really read. So low alphabetic, or how do you say that in English? Explain stories very simple.
Super.
Explain what the king said on his yearly speech, but then without difficult words.
Super.
And try to reach another audience. An audience that is low lettered. That's what you say in English?
Low literacy.
Yeah, low literacy part of the population.
Super.
And I think that was really a strong idea. And they do it. They do it all the time now.
Nice.
And it's part of the whole setup at nu.nl. And I think that's a way to reach out to another part of the audience. And of course, our public television does the same. They have the jeugdjournaal, so for young people. But in reality, lots of people who are not really well educated watch jeugdjournaal to just get by. Yeah. And I think that's also, especially for newspapers, quality newspapers like NRC Handelsblad, as far as I can see, they don't think about those kind of things.
But there's a big if here.
The big if.
Money.
Money?
Or bigger if, access, basically. So I remember when I entered journalism school in 2011, this was this moment where newspapers were dying. There was no future in paper. We had BuzzFeed and we had Vice and all these other new outlets, and they were the future, and they are the future ones. BuzzFeed News has gone bankrupt recently, or they closed down. Vice is going bankrupt, and these were free media publications, bringing quality news. Especially BuzzFeed has done a lot of,
BuzzFeed News.
BuzzFeed News, yeah. It was a good free online publication, making it very accessible to a lot of people. Nu.nl is a very good free publication. But of course, someone needs to pay for the content, for making a quality newspaper. Advertisers, but also in the past 10 years, we've seen a movement towards, 10 years ago it was 80% advertisers, 20% readers. It's completely flipped. For subscription base, but to get access to these quality newspapers, you need to pay for it. So with BuzzFeed dying and other online free publications in trouble, I'm quite worried actually about creating the access or the possibilities of access for people, especially people who might want to touch into more quality news, but don't really know where to look. So that's a bigger problem behind all this, and that's also something that I want to ask you about. How can you find more people, or how can you make people more susceptible to reading quality news then?
So yeah, great questions. As you mentioned, we've been touching on many things, and I just want to clarify one thing, that I do think we should care about echo chambers and filter bubbles and misinformation. So it's not either or, but I do think that for many years now, many people have been focusing on the latter without taking the broader step back picture of the overall media ecosystem and users' consumption. So yeah, because again, it can be 10 people or 100 people in bigger countries, but for example, it was how many people stormed the Capitol in the United States, right, on January 6th. Not that many, but still they have kind of shaken, this. Exactly, right? So I'm not saying that we don't need to care about them. We should tackle both problems at the same time. I just kind of want to focus our attention on the other one.
But I think I think that the whole Capitol stormers, that's for the police and the security services. But for reaching out to the audience, the general audience, that's more for people who think about algorithms and the owners of YouTube and the owners of Facebook to put news more in. So to serve democracy, they should think about that. And when your algorithms are completely finalized, they should introduce it, maybe paid by George Soros or whatever. And we as newspapers and media outlet should think about reaching the audience that is not really into news.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Well, I just want to, maybe second that and point out, I think, the underlying premise here, which is that news media is the only route through which people can encounter quality information in society. I mean, we have to ask the question, if only 3 or 4% are clicking on news media, or maybe 10% watching news in the evening, where are people getting their information? And these people are voting, right? So how are they getting informed? I mean, they're getting information somehow. I mean, maybe it's from their social network, maybe it's more casually on social media, and that's not captured in the metrics of what people are clicking on, but it's scrolling past, or they're seeing something that's politically related on TikTok, which might not fit the category of political information, but it kind of frames an issue in a particular way and gets them to think about the issue in a particular way. So I mean, I think this is all kind of underlying, like, how do we define news? How do we define quality news? And how do we define news sources?
Absolutely, but yes, absolutely. That's why in one of the studies that we did, the table I showed, we were also looking at exposure to political information conceived very broadly outside of news, right? So, for example, when you read Women's Health magazine, you can see a news story about women's rights or abortion, for example, right? Absolutely. At the same time, I think that many people just aren't informed. Period. You know, I teach American undergraduate students at the public university, and I teach a class on political communication. And always at the beginning, I ask, do any of you consume news? I have 50 students in a class. There are maybe 2 hands up, right? And then I see, do you see any information on social media that's about politics? You know, maybe 10 hands up. And those are students. That's, you know, the elite, the future of our countries. You know, one student asked me, what's the State of the Union? You know, it was right after, you know, the State of the Union, right? Let alone watch it, right? And Dutch people know what it is, and it was a student who had no idea, right? So I think that many people are just not seeing that information. They talk about many things. They don't necessarily talk about politics. So,
yeah, I would like to tap into that. Sure, you have studied this. Generational differences in your data. I mean, there are many worries about younger generations not consuming the news, but also not consuming the news directly, not online, but indirectly through platforms or through search engines, etc. And that, I mean, those numbers are on the rise. At least they are in the Netherlands. I know that. The numbers are from Reuters, so it is self-reported, which I now realize is not maybe the best measure. But what is your take on that and on those generational differences? Do we need to worry about declining trends in direct news consumptions among younger generations, offline as well as online?
So, you know, I will agree with what Nick said, right? That we shouldn't be too, so to speak, elitist and only focus on, you know, credible news sources, news organizations, that as long as people are getting their veggies, maybe it doesn't have to be broccoli, right? But if they put the broccoli on the pizza, like at least they're getting some political information. It doesn't have to be in, you know, in Volkskrant, but I'm not sure whether people are, right? So also what I showed in one of the slides, Facebook estimates that from everything that circulates on the platform, again, this is news, right? So news is only 1.8%, right? So some people maybe, again, many people report that they see news, right? Or politics, incidentally so-called. But we also know that, for instance, algorithms, right? They recommend to you content that's aligned with what you are already interested in, with your past behavior on the platform and so forth. So if your past behavior is mostly entertainment focused, and most people go online and to platforms for entertainment, you will not suddenly see news in your feed. The same if your network, if your friends on social media are not politically inclined and are not interested, you will also not see. So, you know, those of you who are here are, of course, interested in what we are discussing, but sit with another person who's kind of very different than you are and look at your Twitter or your Facebook or whatever platform you're using and somebody else's. It's a completely different world, right? So I think many young people aren't seeing that content.
And what is your, if we talk about the broccoli on the pizza, what is your idea about the traditional news brands in that sense? Because for many people, older generations, they were socialized with those news brands and also connecting those traditional news brands, the broccoli, so to speak, to journalistic values like independence and pluralism and diversity and factuality. And I think I see a big risk there, that younger generations just, they kind of have their broccoli on the pizza and are not that socialized with those brands anymore. Isn't that a risk? What is your idea, or what are your ideas?
If I can add to that a little bit, I think that some of the biggest news media in the Netherlands are completely unknown by most people in this room.
Yeah.
Namely NOS Stories, which is based on the public broadcaster, but bringing it for younger people, which is I think more than 1 million followers on Instagram. It's a platform like Sam Mokro, which is mostly unknown, but has hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram, and those are. They are platforms where younger people are getting their news, but it's just not, it's not NRC, which kind of worries me. But so, does it matter?
Yeah.
Like Alice was asking as well, because you could argue it is broccoli, right?
Yeah.
It might not be broccoli the way that it might be genetically modified, but it is still broccoli.
So I think that that's okay, right? As long as we have, I don't know those platforms personally, but so I don't know whether they have that adhere to those journalistic standards of kind of objectivity, of verification of the facts, right? But as long as people are getting some veggies, yes, I believe that's okay, right? So we kind of also need to embrace that, the time when everybody consumes the, 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. newscast is gone, because now there's satellite, cable, and online. So not everybody will congregate along next to their TV set.
And maybe I'll just add in a little bit about some of the algorithms that we've studied on these platforms as well. I mean, and we haven't looked at Instagram, and we haven't looked at the Dutch media system, but in some of our studies of looking at TikTok, for instance, in the U.S., we actually find that there's really not very much news at all by traditional standards. And even if you start following a bunch of news outlets on TikTok, the algorithm just doesn't pick up on it. It just doesn't really serve news to people. And so even if you were news interested, how do you convey that to the algorithm to get into a positive feedback loop where it's showing you more information, more news?
But I don't know if you looked into that, because you're working in the US. But is there a discussion among the owners of these big platforms about news? Is it an issue for them, or are they just in it for the money and they don't care?
Well, my sense about TikTok is that it's really was founded as an entertainment platform, and news is news and I think. I think they even lump news and entertainment into one trends category, so it's not really its own thing.
Yeah, but actually the owners probably are mostly in it for the money, and which is essentially user engagement. So actually a few years ago, Facebook announced that it's decreasing its news in the algorithm. So it went down from, I think, 4.5% a few years ago to 1.8 right now, and that was a conscious decision, because the fear is that if there is more news, either there will be problematic content, or that users will simply disengage because the users don't want news, right? So that's also where we kind of come to the issue of content, right? That's a lot of the news, and in the US it's dramatic. It's focusing only on conflict. It's focusing only on negativity. It's only, you can open very high quality, broccoli news organization, and it's always clashes between, the two sides.
Yeah,
right? So people
this is something that I did want to touch upon, because the classic journalistic response to this is, sure, we get it, but the world is conflictual, and we're just reporting the conflict that's out there. Mm-hmm. And when we would focus on the consensus in society, we would be, not bringing or not reporting society as it is. Well, I'm
So I don't think so, right? I absolutely don't think so. I think, for example, I have been living in the United States for the past 6 years. Before I lived in Amsterdam. But for example, during the State of the Union that I mentioned on CNN, for example, the President Joe Biden was speaking, and the camera went to the audiences, and they found a Republican politician whose name I forget, who was rolling his eyes, right? And that's what the CNN reported, like somebody who was obviously disapproving of what the Democratic president was saying, right? But I'm absolutely confident that there were many Republican politicians in the audiences who were agreeing with President Biden, right? But it depends on what you focus on.
Well, I want to add to Harm, actually, because he's looking pretty skeptical about this.
No, I'm not skeptical. No, I'm not. I was just, I had something in my eye.
Oh.
No, I'm not. I think that, I totally agree with you.
So but this only answers the question of polarization, right? So if you would report more on consensus, you would perhaps have less polarization, and or does it also lead to more
people could actually maybe, right, people would maybe tune into news as well, because many people are just sick of the negativity. At least that's what some surveys find.
So is that the solution to getting more people to
I mean, there's for sure
news?
not one solution only, but I think it could be one for sure. And again, based on what people are saying, that could be one of the solutions.
And I think we also, again, need to look at the larger media ecology, right? So it's not just about that media is reporting on conflict. It's that the algorithms love controversy and conflict, and they amplify that because it gets clicks. Yeah. And it's that feedback loop, right? So that shows the media, oh, yeah, we need to do more controversy, more conflict, and let's do more of that.
Yeah.
So even if you have like your newspaper, I mean, it's a big newspaper, there's lots of people working there. So even if you have 10 articles about conflict and 2 about non-conflict and 4 neutral and some about entertainment, the ones with the biggest juice is and that's picked up by the algorithm. So even when your own newspaper or your own title is trying to be balanced, the unbalanced stuff will be picked up and amplified, isn't it?
So then the point is to nudge the algorithms, right? That's your point.
Well, I mean, I think one of the issues we might be dealing with is the perception of polarization, right? And the fact that an algorithm amplifies the perception of controversy because, again, to your point, if there's 2 of the 10 articles that are controversial and those are the ones that get picked up, that creates a larger perception of controversy than there actually exists, maybe.
Yeah,
but it's also a paradox. I mean, for instance, I was here at this tank, just like I told you. The Vakkerman was shouting, there was a megaphone, there were lots of people very agitated, as you might all have seen. Who saw this interaction between the directeur of the Bali and this guy who try to do the interview, and he got really angry?
It's a very international audience, so...
Yeah, it's a very so some people saw it. So, I mean, this was really pumped up in the Dutch media. But when I was there at the tank, one day, the Vakkerman was there shouting. The next day, there was nobody, and the tank was just there. Yeah. So that was more or less the normal state of affairs. There was a tank from Russia on the Leidse Square. There were people walking around it, parents explaining to their children that the tank was there and what the reason it's there, and they just walked on, and that's it.
Yeah.
But the moment that there's shouting and there's a little fight, it goes all over the internet, and people think there must be a huge issue on this square, and it's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that's what you mean, right?
Absolutely.
It's the effective, the perceived polarization in society, right? Yeah. Maybe a related issue, but I'm not sure whether it is indeed part of your research. But this also touches upon discussions that I know that journalists have in newsrooms about giving attention to certain political actors that really fuel this polarization in society and have very now I see your reaction. Provocative rhetoric. Yeah, but that's a dilemma, right? Because it is consumed big time by the audience, and still there is a responsibility, I think, on the journalistic side to give this attention or not.
Well, I think it is sort of a chicken-egg discussion that is taking place in a lot of newsrooms. Like, is the fact that we're reporting on this well, let's name him Thierry Baudet. Does reporting on Thierry Baudet lead to more seats in the polls and in the second chamber of the Netherlands or in elections, or are we merely reporting on his popularity? It's probably somewhere in between. Because I'm skeptical of the whole idea that he's big because media reported about him, but I'm also skeptical. Well, I mean, there's always a breeding ground for these kind of politicians, I think.
But when I worked at nu.nl, the editorial board there, or the guys who were, I mean, I was most of the time here in Amsterdam, but the guys at the desk, let's say, it was always a discussion. I mean, do you give attention to Thierry Baudet for people from abroad? He said, I'm a politician whose only goal is to create ophef, to arouse.
And also with disinformation, and that does touch
with
on
disinformation. He didn't say disinformation because his facts are the truth, isn't it? Anyway, so we always had the discussion about him and other politicians at the desk, because many times, or not many times, a few times, I went and they said, we're not going to publish, because why should we? And that's also the case with other politicians, populist politicians, whose only goal it is to arouse attention for themselves and for their ideas. So I think that there's a shift, at least in Dutch media, going on from the times when Pim Fortuyn came up, you know, this former politician who was killed, to now that media are putting the boundary much higher. Also, you see that at talk shows.
And is it working? Like, do you see? And this is also, you know, I'm very interested in this. Do you see when media are reporting more and more on populist leaders, does it lead to more or less people tuning in or tuning out to quality news? Because that's basically the claim.
So sadly, yes, right? So there is research that the traffic to news websites after Trump stopped being president actually decreased. Yeah. So people were following more news.
Yeah, but so nu.nl decided not to do it.
Yeah, yeah. But that's actually also right. Also, that's in my view, that's a wonderful decision, because we know that also when reporting on misinformation, we know that more people who'd never know that something was said that's not true was said would actually learn about it.
So, and it's not about a partisan. Sorry.
Yeah, it's both.
It's just
right?
very quickly. It's not about a partisan position of this political actor, because that's always the accusation, right? That you don't give it. That you would. Freedom of speech, right? That you don't give the room for the politician. That's not. I don't think that's the issue here. The issue is the disinformation part of it, and that you, by repeating those claims, you give room to it and attention. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's both. Absolutely. So it's right. It's on the one hand giving additional audience for pieces of information that would never be seen. It's also giving additional platform to politicians who are provocateurs.
But if the claim is that more people are tuning into quality news when there's a polarized politician, doesn't that undermine the whole point that people want more consensus-based reporting? Is my question to you.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. That's a good paradox, right? Because it's not my point that that's what people want. That's what people say they want. And at least people say that they tune out of politics. But yeah, it is a paradox. People say many people say they tune out of politics because it's too conflictual, right? But then also during President Trump, right, they were tuning in more.
Yeah, but at the moment at the media say, no, we should really watch out and don't bring everything, bring every story. Then Thierry Baudet starts to build his own little empire, and everybody who wants to follow him and wants to see what he's doing can go to his own news desk that he has now. And
it's not a big empire, though, right?
No, it's not a big empire. It's a small little echo chamber he built for himself. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to the audience, because I can imagine that there are a lot of questions, and there's the first question about this topic. Please be polarized but civil. So yeah, I think you were the first to raise your hand.
Hi, Magdalena, thank you for your happy presentation. My name is Jo Bardoel and I worked with the University of Amsterdam. we are talking about quality, or you are talking about quality news all the time. And I find that a bit problematic. Of course, I'm a bit older. I read all these four newspapers that were mentioned, not on paper, but on iPad, but very traditional. But when I talk with my students, for instance, also journalist students, they didn't watch the news very often. They watched talk shows or these news shows with stand-up comedians and so on. So the question is, what is quality news? And maybe the whole definition of quality news should be redefined in the sense that it is also elite news. It is formal politics. If you're here in Amsterdam, for instance, I read also Parool. It's a small newspaper, and most of the people here, they don't get that news. So, in a sense, it should be relevant news and quality news.
Yes.
It's such an old-fashioned assumption about politics and about political participation, etc. So that I wanted to question, you know, that definition of quality news, which seems to be quite central.
Yes, no, that's a wonderful point, and that's a kind of also that's true, that's what I emphasized during the presentation and kind of hearing the discussion. We did say that as long as people consume some veggies, right, that aren't, so some news, some political information, but I agree, and that's what Nick mentioned as well, that now we need to redefine, we need to have different perceptions as to what is relevant political information. So yes, so absolutely, your point is very well taken, and I agree.
But who decides what relevant information is?
Yeah.
The individual. The individual consumer, I suppose. So in a democracy, they now have all the tools available to them to observe the world through various media channels. They don't need elites necessarily to construct an account of the world to tell them how things are going.
Yeah, but then kind of but then what happens with those journalistic values, right? So that's something that
I'm trying to be provocative.
Okay. You said it in such a matter-of-factual way that, yeah. Right, so yes, I agree with you, right? That also what you mentioned about...
Too easy, but
No, but like we don't have definitions, right? We don't yet have any metrics or theoretical or practical as to how much a person needs to consume, what it is that they need to consume, where they need to consume it in order to be like an effective citizen. Right? We don't have that, and I absolutely don't have the answer yet. But for example, what you mentioned about your newspaper providing kind of more lay or lower, you know, not elite explanation of what's happening. That
many regional newspapers behind the organization Nu.nl, and therefore, because the national newspapers were always elite newspapers, and the regional newspapers, they didn't reach everybody. Not most of my family. I come from a peasant background, and I'm the only one, I guess, in the family of 8 Catholic, you know, so in Poland you know that also. I'm maybe the only one, or only 2 that read newspapers, you know, the rest doesn't. And the question was, where do they get their information? In the past, it was very clear in my village where I came from. Everybody voted for the Catholic Party, you know, as they sometimes still do in Poland, maybe. And now you see that, so the whole idea about political participation, that there are people that had information in the past and now that is going down or something is also highly questionable, I think. But sorry for...
Yeah, well, I see, thank you for your question. I see another question there.
Hi, thanks for the great discussion. My name is Sumit Mehra from the RIVM, Public Health Institute. I was actually, I found it striking, like the first study, if I understood it correctly, people reading news of the opposite side, like they weren't really influenced by it. Perhaps it's because of they're getting paid or they're not really paying attention to it, but besides that. But then as a solution it is presented, people perhaps should consume more news, but maybe eating broccoli doesn't really increase your vitality. So what does it really prevent? I mean, I think there's a difference between consuming news and making informed decisions or not getting polarized. So is it a solution? So even if people are going to watch much more news, is it going to prevent some things we are concerned about?
Yeah, so is more news consumption, is your question, is it going to prevent from more polarization?
So yeah, in many of our studies, and that's a very good point, in many of our studies we find that exposure has no effects. And we test many, we even in some studies we tested knowledge, we tested political participation, intentions to be politically active, we tested misinformation endorsement, polarization and so forth, and we find no effects at all, right? So in a sense then the question could be why promote something that you yourself find has no effect. But also, I do believe, and that's something that social science is not well equipped to test, that these exposure have cumulative longitudinal overtime effects, right? So in that study that you mentioned, people were paid to do that over a period of 12 days. Right, that's not that much. I was thinking like, yeah, of course something should happen during that time, but we found that very little happened. In other studies, we are looking at much longer time periods, spanning 6 months or 9 months, using all the data that we have, and we also don't find anything, right? So again, kind of there are several related questions that on the one hand, we are looking still at a limited time span, and that maybe, right, seeing some information can make people, kind of what you're also doing with easier language, right, can make people kind of hooked in, right? Like, oh, I see this, so then the next story they will see some, or they will understand it more because they will know what's happening, they will have the background. And the second thing is also that that in my work we were looking only at online consumption, right? Because we know that when you ask people, do you consume news or how much? Everybody says, yes, I do 7 days a week, which we know it's not true. People over-report because there is a social desirability, right? That consuming news, it's that elitist idea that yes, you should be a news consumer. So we only look at online behavioral data. So also maybe people were not influenced because maybe they had some other counter forces outside of their online environment, or maybe they were, I don't know. We were looking at a small slice, so maybe that's why also we're not finding effects.
I would agree with that observation that it's a very layered. It's a very layered process, I guess. So it's very tough to go from 1 or 2 experiments with short-term manipulations to drawing conclusions how people really process the information.
And of course, promoting news exposure is not the only remedy. Far from it, right? We should have civic education in schools. We should have like many more things that many countries do not have.
Nicholas?
I think it also potentially prompts a question for the journalists on the panel, which is, to what extent should news organizations be responsible for evaluating the effect and the impact of the content that they produce for society? Are you measuring understanding, political participation as a result of consumption? Are you interested in understanding those things? Maybe not you individually, but maybe your organizations?
I don't think organizations, I think organizations are looking into a lot of impact, basically. But the impact that they're measuring is mostly clicks. When do people, no, not clicks, really. Like, I know
it's all about the money.
In the 6 years that I've been working for my newspaper, I've never heard someone say clicks. It's mostly about how long people read something, and how engaged they are with it. And if it gets a conversation going, if it gets people more interested in this specific topic and clicking through to other stories that are about this topic. So I think that's what, in my experience, media organizations are mostly interested about. On a more abstract level, I do feel that in the past, well, basically since Trump and Brexit, media and liberal democracies are more aware of the role that they play. Like Washington Post talking about, democracy dies in darkness, and that's why buy a subscription, basically. But there is some truth to that, and I do feel like it's more it's a more pressing issue than perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. But Harm, you're much more experienced in Dutch media than I am.
No, I think that at least at nu.nl, they are really thinking about their role and reaching out. The one example was these low literacy. But the other thing is that they always think we have to explain even the most simple things. What does it mean? Because always there are people there at the desk who ask the most simple questions, and then I say, yeah, but everybody knows. No, we want to have a story about this, about what you're saying now. Just explain what's going on, and that's, well, I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, I mean, your question about do they think about the effects of their reporting on the level of awareness or democracy or resilience? I don't think so, really. No. No. No, I don't think so. No. I mean, maybe.
Why not?
That's not. I don't see it as our role, basically. But I'm just a simple reporter. But I also think our editors-in-chief, maybe they do some discussions sometimes. But maybe guys like you should go to these desks and talk about it. But I mean, everybody's busy with their day-to-day affairs, and it's difficult as it is. I mean, and I think it's very difficult to measure.
But still, if you have discussions about not covering certain populist, I mean, that I would see that as a kind of taking responsibility as well.
Sure, but that's in day-to-day business.
Yeah, sure, okay. That fits into the day-to-day routine, but not in a larger picture. Okay.
Okay, so we have time for one or maybe two short questions. And I see two hands, so that's great. Or
Thank you for the great discussion. I just have a question about how do you see the future of news in relation to these new media that are coming up, and especially social media? Because as Magdalena, you mentioned the actual news, like Facebook and social media channels are actually pushing down or pushing out a little bit, or lowering at least the news that they're sharing. My point would be, is there really even a point for them to not do that? Because obviously a lot of the politicians, institutions, actors, wherever news is happening, they obviously have direct access to people, to a lot of people through these media, So my question would be, what's the role of news still in relation to that? Since so much can be consumed directly from the people, Trump can send a tweet and people already know that it happened. And also, like, and what's the future then for news agencies like yourself in that respect?
Well, I do recognize what you're saying, because I've had experience as a political reporter where parties would say to me, yeah, there's no point in talking to you despite having 300,000 daily readers, because we have our own channels of reaching the people that we want to reach. The thing that I'm mostly worried about right now is that the death of BuzzFeed News, and of other free quality online publications that were quite good in reaching people who are not willing to pay $600 a year for a New York Times subscription, but who are interested in reaching or in reading quality news. And what I think is going to put pressures on professional media organizations in the upcoming 10 years is the death of paper. So yes, I'm very confident that the New York Times will still be existing in 10 years. I don't think they're going to be making a newspaper on a daily basis anymore, which makes a lot of sense. But it's going to put pressure on the financial models. And then the question is going to be, if BuzzFeed News died, if Vice died, and all these other platforms, what's going to be the role of a New York Times or an NRC or a Follow the Money in a very hyper-fragmented media landscape? I'm not too optimistic, but hopefully you are.
I guess just to throw something else into the mix here, I mean, you're also staring down the development of new technologies like generative AI, which, if you've played with Google Bard or Bing Search, their chat experience, I mean, these are not good experiences right now, but we can expect that over the next 5 years, they're going to get better and better. And they're going to, again, totally disintermediate and become the interface that people use to information, including all kinds of news information. And so imagine a world where you don't get your news from a trusted news brand. You go to a search engine and you type in a question, and it creates essentially a news article. It writes it, right? In 30 seconds, you have a personalized, tailor-made news article. So what is the role for the news organization in that world? It's basically, well, sorry to say, news organizations lost the distribution game to social media. This means they're going to start losing the production or the writing aspect to the craft. So where does that leave media? It leaves them in news gathering. That's the most expensive part of producing the media, is actually taking the time to collect the information.
Yeah, I don't think it's just going to be news gathering. I think our work going to be more storytelling, because I do think that style and writing a good narrative journalistic piece. Actually, I think the opposite of what you're saying when it comes to news gathering. I think that when a lot of the things that we're publishing right now could be really much ChatGPT. Small new articles just bringing factual information. A lot of our daily time goes to those kind of things. Whereas when you talk about good writing, good narrative writing, good narrative reporting, going out, speaking to people, going to an event where there's no robot, where there are a lot of people, that's going to be... So, the positive twist might be that AI is going to take a lot of the shitty stuff out of our hands, making us, or giving us more time to do actual reporting on the ground.
Well, that's what I mean by news gathering, reporting, collecting information. Yeah. But I don't entirely disagree with you in the sense that I think there will be a market for really high-end, powerfully written material. But I think we can expect the market to continue to shift.
Isn't the problem also that from a democratic perspective, you want to have those journalistic values covered, right? And that the part of this whole information environment that you can actually guide by those values, and that you can actually kind of regulate in terms of public values, that it gets smaller and smaller and smaller in relation to the complete information environment we live in. I think that's the worrisome picture I have in my mind for the next few decades. That, I mean, sure, it will be there, it will still be there, it will survive in that sense. And I think also that this is already part of a larger trend that you described, that the traditional news brands focus more and more on those storytelling production instead of the fast news, because they kind of have lost ground to the nu.nl companies. But I think from a democratic perspective, that kind of worries me, that the kind of the area that we have control over is getting smaller in relation to the rest.
Final question in the back.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the great discussion. Super interesting. So I was curious about the part, Magdalena, you mentioned in your presentation about avoidance, or sort of this lack of engagement. So I was wondering if you have had a look or plan to have a look at the sort of mechanism behind that. So is it sort of the sentiment of like quantity over quality, some sort of like media fatigue almost, or is it a sense of a news consumer that they already know enough that they don't need to sort of search further? Sort of wondering what your thoughts are on that. Yeah.
So we haven't looked at that specifically in our study, in our data, but concurrently there has been growing research looking at the reasons for news avoidance. As we spoke earlier, kind of in the panel, there are many different reasons depending on the audiences. For those who used to be very engaged with news media, they now report or say during interviews. So there's fantastic work that's being done using both in-depth kind of qualitative long interviews or surveys as well. So they would say that news are too negative, right? That they just don't want to watch news or read news anymore because it's too negative and it affects their well-being. And so it generates anxiety or stress and so forth. And yet other people, for example, are overwhelmed. So it's kind of what we've also touched on, that there's just too much information available online. So people just tune out because they have this problem that there's just too much. So they don't know what to choose, they don't know what to trust, and they just select something else. And yet there is another group of people who just doesn't see news as relevant to their lives. So, you know, my life is okay. Here I am going to work, going to school or whatever. So why should I care, right? So that's yet this other group. And that's the group precisely for whom I believe the algorithms kind of could really make a difference, because if they... The nudging, yeah, because if, right, just kind of putting some information in their environment. And there is probably another group of people, I don't know to what extent here, but for sure in the US, where there is very little social security, very little kind of social welfare, right? People who may have to be working 2 jobs and, you know, and feed their kids, so they don't have time at all to even look at that because they worry about their day-to-day survival. So I think that there are many different reasons, and that kind of comes also in studies. Yeah, we haven't, personally, I haven't looked into that, but other studies have, and it's very complex.
Nicholas, the final words.
No pressure. I wasn't ready for that. Just to channel the inner technologist that I am, since I'm actually a computer scientist by training, you know, I think there's an untapped potential of personalization, yes. And the capabilities of, let's say, generative AI to personalize things like headlines, to make them more relevant to individuals. So sure, you know, write the high quality news article about whatever is going on that's important in the world, but then tailor the framing of that message to individuals to arouse their connection to why is it interesting to me. Yes. And I think there's a real potential there. We've done some studies in my lab at Northwestern where you can see opportunities there. So that's a hopeful message to close on.
All right. Well, thank you, Harm. Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Alit, and thank you, audience, for coming here today. Well, that's it. If I'm not wrong, we'll be home in time for the 8 o'clock news. So that's good news.